What in the world does Paul mean when he says, forgiven in the sight of Christ for your sake? Strange words. Well, one thing, you can't understand this without understanding more than mostly is taught about our role in the forgiveness of others and our priestly standing in Christ Jesus. Now, I just did another lesson on that in 1 John 5, and in the previous lesson, in this verse in 2 Corinthians 2:10, part 1 is about that verse and how it relates to this verse, and this is the one we tie it all in. So if you haven't seen that one, it would be a good time now to pause or go back and look at the 2 Corinthians 2:10 part 1 video, or go to the various Bible lessons and look at the 1 John 5:16 lesson, which is the same lesson. And then we can proceed with what is Paul talking about here in 2 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 10. Okay, I assume that you've seen that lesson now on 1 John 5:16. So we'll read 2 Corinthians 2:10. If you forgive anyone, I also forgive him. And what I have forgiven, if there was anything to forgive, I have forgiven in the sight of Christ for your sake. Now let's pull this verse apart into its pieces, make some sense out of it. Without the context, it makes very little sense. In this whole large context, which actually extends back to the letter of 1 Corinthians, there had been someone in the church who had sinned and continued to sin blatantly with a very nasty violation of morals. And the church was instructed to stop being so tolerant and not to be patting themselves on the back on how tolerant they were, which sounds like the churches today, isn't it? And instead, to apply what we sometimes call church discipline, what the Church of Christ calls disfellowshipping and the Baptists call churching. Okay, so they had done this. Now we get to 2 Corinthians, and in talking about his travel plans and why they changed, Paul got off into the whole subject of this disciplinary matter, how it was handled, how they did what was needed, how the person came back to his senses, and how they should restore him. But there had been a lot of turmoil with the whole thing. So Paul is now dealing with all of the turmoil that came out of that incident. And he says, if you forgive anyone, I also forgive him. And what I have forgiven, if there was anything to forgive, I have forgiven in the sight of Christ for your sake. Now, first, let's go into if there was anything to forgive. I do not believe that he was questioning whether or not there was anything that had been done wrong or whether anything needed to be forgiven. Some people have tried to take that and have opened a little door through which they have driven an entire caravan, trying to say that some whole areas that the Bible calls sin, if there was anything to forgive, it is like, well, culturally people thought it was sin, but there really wasn't anything to forgive because it really wasn't sin. No, that's not what he's saying here. What he's saying is more about that if you know of some offense, then this is how we're dealing with it. If it's not there, or if in any case, and I really think that it has to do with any case, in each case that I'm aware of, I, Paul, am aware of, that there was sin, I have forgiven it. But there's many people in the church in Corinth. He's not saying, I forgive all of you in Corinth. Some of you in Corinth, I didn't need to forgive, and some I did. And I'm not going to name names. But those that did something that I need to forgive, yes, I did forgive. And the rest of you, there was no need to forgive. I believe that's what he's saying here. Now, if you forgive, I also forgive. He's saying in the things that I don't know about, I'm trusting that you will, acting as a church with the church's authority to bind and loose, that was not given to one man to be passed down through some kind of bureaucratic heredity to some other one man, but rather to the whole church. It's a plural you when you were given the keys. It's the whole church has the ability to bind and loose, and that he's saying you all can do the bind and loose. If you forgive anyone, I also forgive him. But then he says, I have forgiven in the sight of Christ. So he's saying, I didn't just personally forgive, I forgave in the sight of Christ. What does it mean to forgive in the sight of Christ? I am convinced that he is talking about the same thing John was talking about in 1 John 5. What Stephen did actually for Saul, when he was Saul, when Stephen was being stoned. Father, do not hold this sin to their charge. So he is saying that not only does he personally forgive, but that he has confidently asked God to forgive these sins. Confident that through the authority, the incredible priestly authority that has been given to us as the church and as individual Christians, that Christ, based on his blood at the cross, that we have been given, has applied that blood to those sins and forgiven them. That's what he means when he says, I have forgiven in the sight of Christ.